Straw hats, their history and manufacture. Chapter 1. Origin and Classical History. The origin of what is known as a straw hat is lost in the mists of antiquity. Ambiguous references to what may have been hats of vegetable materials are to be found in the works of almost all ancient writers, but very little that is specific can be discovered. Perhaps one reason for the paucity of information on this subject may be that the homemade hats of plaited straws or rushes were probably worn only by the common people. With society as it existed in early days, if such were the case, the matter would be considered almost too vulgar for the classical writers to mention. Doubtless, in the earliest stages of human development, any kind of convenient material was utilized by primeval man in the endeavor to keep his head or body warm or cool, as the case might require. Now, the mere fact of the shelter afforded by trees would create some inducement towards using leaves for covering the body, for one may assume that even before vegetable products were gathered and used, say as thatch for collective shelter, some of them were adopted for individual protective purposes. The earliest reference to such is the well-known account of the Aprons of Fig Leaves, mentioned in the 3rd chapter of Genesis. This primitive method of clothing was soon followed by the use of skins, as noted later in the same chapter, but even in this record, the vegetable product was used by man before that of animals, and shows in a most unmistakable, even if allegorical, manner the natural trend of all development, that articles easiest to procure are those that are first used. It is therefore not unfair to assume that the manipulation of vegetable fibers, such as leaves, rushes, straws, and other similar products, was really the earliest textile operation. That once conceded, it is no long step to the use of the plaited article as a head covering. The Encyclopaedia Britannica, in its articles on costume and hats, states that the modern hat can be traced back to the Pettus, worn by the ancient Romans when on a journey, and similar hats, known as the Corsa, were also used by ancient Greeks on like occasions. The Greek Corsa and the Roman Pettus are described as hats of a pliant material which could be bent down at the sides like that worn by Atalanta. Lacroix, a French writer on the subject, assures us that the early Romans and Franks sought bast and straw of which to make them hats, and there is an antique statue of Mercury in the Vatican at Rome which has for a head covering a hat of a wide-awake nature, sculptured in close imitation of a finely plaited straw. The goddess Hera, the Grecian name for the Roman Juno, queen of Olympus, is depicted on ancient vases, coins, and statues wearing a Stephanos. One of the statues, the original of which was told by Praxiteles, representing Hera Teleia, is known to moderns by copies to be found in the Vatican and other museums. Pausanias, speaking of the coins of Argos, specifically describes Hera as wearing a Stephanos. This was a head covering consisting only of a crown, similar in shape to a modern Turkish fez inverted, of the same breadth and height all round, and was made of various vegetable products. In the British Museum is to be seen a small terracotta figure seated wearing the above sketched Stephanos, in which the plaiting marks of coarse vegetable fibers are very distinct. This is probably the earliest extant record in the plastic art of a straw hat. Wickerwork, polloi kalathoi, was also used by the ancient Greeks to make brimless hats. The ancient Etruscans wore what was known as a tutulus, a brimless hat with a high pointed center to the crown, and a broad-brimmed hat, similar to the Pettus, but with a pointed top like the tutulus. Etruria covered the district now occupied by the Italian straw plait and hat makers, but while there is an extreme likelihood, from the shape of the hat in the accompanying sketch, that the denizens of this fertile champaign, producing as it does, and probably did, unlimited materials that could be plaited, made these hats of straw, there is no definite information as to their being constructed of any vegetable fibers. Another very important link of classical interest with the remote past is shown in the two sketches of hats and bonnets as worn by the ancient inhabitants of ill-fated Pompeii. The mural decorations of this long-buried city illustrate in a far more cogent manner than any other known examples the probable actual appearance of the people who lived there before its catastrophe. And the hat shown in the head of Penelope is a model that has been imitated during the last 35 years. The little knob on the top, however, is quite novel. The other example from Pompeii is from a comic fresco in which two men, dressed as women, are having an altercation. And here the artist has not only shown the lines which indicate the ridges of a woven vegetable fiber hat, but this painting provides the first known drawing of a bonnet. Note the tilt at which it is worn and the portion cut out at the base to admit the neck, and also the absolute resemblance to what is known as a granny bonnet. A very famous writer of antiquity, perhaps one of the best known except Caesar to all scholars of Latin, Virgil, makes allusion in his pastorals to the plaiting of osiers and willows. Probably there is no race of men that has so closely maintained to the present time its ancient forms of clothing as have the Arabs, and they occasionally wear a hat made of twisted bands of straw, similar to a beehive. They are the only Muslims that do, and there is no trace of any other people of that religion wearing a similar head covering. All this evidence from the Greco-Roman and other ancient sources proves that the making in some way of straw hats was fairly general, even in the earliest times in the countries of Asia Minor and southeastern Europe. But some writers on the subject favor the claims of the Black Forest of Germany as having been the birthplace of the industry. This, of course, may be so, however, no Germanic or Teutonic writers of equal antiquity have handed down such direct evidence as that of the Greco-Romans. But it seems a little invidious for any special part of the world to make such a claim, for doubtless the weaving of vegetable fibers was not confined to any particular area, but that primeval man all over the world practiced the operation for his own needs. There are no British records of straw hats until AD 1459, when it is narrated that Sir John Fastolf died possessed of Ige strawen hatters, the Promptorium Parvolorum, of about which that date renders the hat of straw as capedulum. Spenser, Shakespeare, and Thynne, brilliant luminaries of the Elizabethan period, all make allusions to the straw hat. Spenser, the poet laureate of Good Queen Bess, who herself is said to have worn a straw hat that may still be seen at Hatford House, quite early in the 16th century says, "some plaid with straws," etc., while Thynne, around 1570, in his debate between pride and lowliness, writes of a man with a strawn hat upon his head, the which was fastened underneath. Shakespeare, in The Tempest, Act 4, Scene 1, makes Iris say, "You sunburned sicklemen of August weary, come hither from the furrow and be merry. Make holiday, your rye straw hats put on, and these fresh nymphs encounter, every one in country footing." In A Lover's Complaint, the immortal bard still further emphasizes the use, which apparently was fairly general, of the straw hat. Upon her head a plaited hive of straw, which fortified her visage from the sun. This passage is interesting, first on account of the use of the word hive. This object, as used for beekeeping, was without doubt very similar to Shakespeare, and therefore the maid's head covering, as it existed in the imagination of the poet, was probably similar to that worn by the Arabs mentioned previously, for she and they wore it as a protection against the sun's heat. Second, Shakespeare's spelling of the word plaited was undoubtedly the method of spelling current at the time and was phonetic. The author in the foreword bases his reasons for using the double T in plaiting or platter in conjunction with the modern spelling of the word on this and other more recent well-known examples of literature coeval with the birth of the trade in Great Britain. Ben Jonson, the poet laureate of James I, about 1630 in an epigram to Lady Mary Wroth, writes that he saw you wear the wheaten hat, etc. The inimitable diarist Pepys describes an actress at the Duke's Theatre as dressed like a country maid with a straw hat on, and mentions that while staying at Hatfield, the women of the party had pleasure in putting on some straw hats, which are much worn in this country, which did become them mightily, but especially my wife. It may be interesting at this point to mention a widely known subject of which interpretations have been greatly at fault. One of Peter Paul Rubens' best-known paintings is entitled La Dame au Chapeau de Poil. The subject is of a lady wearing a large-brimmed and somewhat high-crowned hat adorned with a sweeping plume of feathers, and many writers on straw hats have endeavored to show that the hat of the picture was made of straw, arguing that the word poil in the title was an ancient form of the French word for straw, pale. It is true that some Old Gaelic writers in mentioning the stalks of cereals have used various methods of spelling, the equivalent for straw. Pale, pale, and pale are to be found in 16th and 17th century books, but in no case has the word poil ever been used, and quite rightly so, because this word means an entirely different thing, and is used today with the same spelling and for the same purpose as it was in the 16th century. Poil means nap, a raised pile, which can be obtained on various fabrics. This consists of a sufficient number of the loose ends of the staple, of which the material is woven or felted, being left on the surface or afterwards raised by means of combs, etc., so as to form either a velvety richness on which the loose ends stand upright, or a glossy finish like that obtained on a man's top hat, where the loose ends are smoothed down. The real translation of the picture's title is The Lady with a Pile Hat, in this case undoubtedly of some felted nature, and of which the actual modern equivalent would be either a beaver, flamand, or velour. From this time onwards, as printing became more general, allusions to straw hats became frequent, and with the advent of periodicals and fashions, etc. for ladies, both letterpress and illustrations confirmed their widespread use. Naturally, detail began to be given, and the poet Gay, in his pastorals, sings of "my new straw hat, thus trimly lined with green." In the Lady's Dictionary, 1694, under the heading of apparel, straw hats are mentioned as among the things necessary to feminine adornment. Miss Constant Isherwood says that straw hats became the rage among the reigning beauties of Queen Anne's court in the early Georgian period. The Ladies' Magazine of the 18th century has many plates showing various styles of what are certainly straw hats, the design and manipulation of the straws in woven hats and the detail in the plait in sewn hats being very carefully and distinctly engraved. These excerpts from ancient as well as more recent authorities all tend to show that the widespread use of the straw hat and prove that the term straw was, as it is now, a most comprehensive one, and one in no way entirely confined to the stalks of cereals. But they also show that although straw hats were made all over the continent, etc., the work on them was purely individual and local. There were no recognized centers of manufacture or distribution, for excepting the fact that some localities were more productive of suitable materials for plaiting than others, the making of straw hats was universal, and it is not until the 16th century that any reliable information is obtainable of special centers for straw hat production. According to Cesare Cantu, a well-known Italian historian, the manufacture of hats of straw in the neighborhood of Florence for distribution outside the locality can be traced back to the 14th century. This is probably quite true, but unfortunately the statement is not corroborated by any contemporaneous evidence. But in the year 1574, Signa, a village near Florence, was entitled the original seat of the industry, from a consular report. It is, therefore, almost safe to declare that the commercial life of the straw hat probably began in the district of Florence, and here, for the first time in history, were to be found gathered together in sufficiently large numbers to make their wares marketable, persons both male and female engaged in weaving straws into hats, or capelli, or in plaiting straws into braids, which were called paglia, or plait. From Tuscany to Piedmont is not a far cry, and Coyat, in his Crudities, a work published in 1611 and consisting of a series of observations made in a journey through Europe, says, "At many places in Piedmont I observed most delicate strawn hats, which both men and women use in most places of that province." Again, Piedmont is not very distant from Lorraine, and it is in this latter district, from which was the country of the birthplace of her mother, that Mary, Queen of Scots, is said to have brought platters to Scotland in 1552, and thus to have introduced the art to the British Isles. Some writers on this subject, failing to discriminate between plat and hats, adduce many adverse arguments, when the claim is made that the unfortunate Queen established the trade in the coasts of Britain. These point to the undoubted fact that straw hats were made both in Scotland and England before her time. That, of course, is quite true, but what is not equally certain is whether the hats made in the British Isles before 1552 were hats woven in one piece, or hats made of plaited braid sewn afterwards in some manner to the required shape. In the old account of the transaction, one reads that in Lorraine, Mary noticed the people profitably employed, some in plaiting straws and others in working the straw plait into hats. It is therefore evident that it was both an established industry in Lorraine and that the operations were being carried on. One may also deduce that while the weaving of hats may have been common in Scotland, the making of plait and the subsequent making into hats was a novelty to Mary, and therefore, in the interests of her Scottish subjects, she endeavoured to promote a similar industry in which they also might be profitably employed. The late Mr. John Waller, of Luton, a member of one of the oldest families connected with the straw trade, after a careful and apparently unbiased investigation, says that the statement about Mary being the founder of the industry can only be regarded as pleasing fiction, and to support this quotes from Old Mixon's History of England, edition of 1724, that the manufacture of straw plait had thriven for about 100 years in the neighbourhood of Hemel Hempstead and Dunstable. But from 1552 to 1624 is a long period, and one can easily imagine the natives of sunny Lorraine feeling none too homelike in Caledonia, stern and wild. With the accession of James I, Mary's son, to the English throne, what could be more natural than the migration of those workers to more genial southerly temperatures, bringing with them their art? As James became king in 1603, there would have been plenty of time for the industry of making plait for sewing into hats being established between then and 1624, which would be exactly 100 years before Old Mixon's account. And speaking of the advent of the Lorrainers into beds and hurts, Mr. Thomas George Austin, in his book on the straw hat and bonnet trade of the Luton district, writes, "It is said to be the true history of the introduction of the handicraft into England." One must therefore come to the conclusion that the system of making hats from plait, as distinct from the weaving of the hat in one piece, was introduced by Mary, Queen of Scots, to Scotland, and from thence the method set forth, and for the reasons which will then be set out hereafter, settled itself in the regions of South Bedfordshire, North East Hertfordshire, and East Buckinghamshire.